All right, greetings everyone. I'm glad you're able to join us this afternoon for a neighborhood resilience webinar. My name is Stephen Deal. I'm Extension Specialist in Land Use Planning with Mississippi Alabama Sea Grant. I'm pleased to have the privilege of discussing with you today and giving some speakers to kind of present some emerging techniques and tools and strategies in the area of neighborhood resilience. And just sort of to give a few basic pointers, just a few logistics to get out of the way. This webinar has been approved for 1.5 continuing education credits through the American Institute of Certified Planners, and we have 1 CFM credit for floodplain managers. And then another thing too is to receive those credits, we will be having some 30 minutes of breakout group discussions. So I encourage all our attendees to stay on for the breakout groups at the end to receive full credit. And we'll have some discussion again to kind of discuss some of the basic elements and some of the tools and strategies we've discussed for neighborhood resilience and how we might apply those to local communities going forward. And also, if you're a webinar attendee seeking continuing education credits, we encourage you to type your name in the chat box once you signed in, and again, once you signed off to confirm full attendance for the event. And getting that, and also just as a little FYI, if you've seen closed captioning for the audio, there should be a button in the toolbar to turn that off and on as needed. So if that, and Renee certainly can assist more if you're having technical difficulties in that regard. Now, just kind of going forward, kind of present some of our speakers. Our first speaker is Dr. Hal Needham. He's a flood scientist for CNC Catastrophe and National Claims. He's worked closely with coastal communities for many years to help improve their resiliency in flood and wind hazards. He has run the USearch project and has worked on creating comprehensive flood archives in various cities, including Galveston, Texas, and more recently, Biloxi, Mississippi, which he will present. And certainly we'll sort of see that going forward. Our other presenter is Megan LaFrombois. She is the assistant professor at Auburn University's Community Planning Program. And her research broadly focuses on community development, urban inequalities, and participatory forms of community planning. And she possesses over 8 years' experience working in community development and planning arenas. And basically here to kind of present some various tools for green infrastructure planning processes and how cities can sort of optimize their strategies in the realm of green infrastructure. Our final presenter will be Sweta Byahut, an associate professor and director in of the Masters of Community Planning program at Auburn University. She has worked for a decade in the planning consultancy in areas of land use planning, land management, development regulation, and post-disaster construction. And she is also interested in the application of spatial analysis tools in built form and landscape analysis. And she'll be co-presenting with Megan to kind of discuss, again, the Green Infrastructure Plan Evaluation Tool. So without further ado, I'll just go ahead and turn it over to our speakers to kind of get the formal presentation started.
Thank you, Stephen, for the warm introductions. This is Dr. Hal Needham. I'm going to share my screen here, and we'll get underway. Can you all see my screen yet?
It's working on it. It says you're starting to share content.
I gotcha.
It doesn't seem to be going. You might want to cancel and try one more time. Maybe it just got hung up in the internet gremlins.
Let me try one more time. We could also, I'm using a second computer today. The first one I had tested in the hurricane when I was in field work. Would it be possible to start with speaker 2 and then I can get the WebEx app on this computer as well? I think that'll help it go faster.
Oh, we can see your screen.
You can? Okay. Fantastic. Thanks, everyone, for your patience. My name is Dr. Hal Needham. I'm lead scientist with CNC Catastrophe and National Claims. I'm going to be sharing some preliminary results of our project that we've worked on in Biloxi for the last year called Improving Flood Resiliency in Biloxi's Economic Development Corridor. And so this project is in partnership with the Northern Gulf of Mexico Sentinel Site Cooperative, Dauphin Island Sea Lab in Alabama, the city of Biloxi, also Mississippi, Alabama Sea Grant, and CNC Catastrophe and National Claims, which is based in Mobile. I'm usually based out of Galveston, Texas, but working all along the Gulf Coast. So I wanted to share a little bit about this. Wanted to share a little bit about this project here. So one thing we noticed when we started working in Biloxi very quickly is that there's a lot of deep history there in Biloxi. So for example, you drive around the city and you start seeing these signs that say Historic Biloxi, established in 1699, some really deep history that would surprise a lot of people going back that far. We see these signs that talk about Biloxi that was founded by the French as New Biloxi, capital of French colony of Louisiana, 1721, 1722. So we're getting back really deep into really the 18th century and the establishment date at the end of the 17th century. See a lot of historic architecture, and some of these old antebellum homes exist that survived numerous severe hurricanes along the coast there. And so there's really a deep history that people love when they get to the Gulf Coast. But then I think in our minds often, we switch from the deep history, the antebellum history and the Victorian architecture, we switch in our minds often to the modern era where we have beach tourism and casinos. And this is often how people will think of the Mississippi coast now, being more, relating to beach tourism, casinos, people coming to the beach for a week, gambling, things like that. But there's a history in the middle that we often forget about, and that's the history really of much of the 20th century, where Biloxi actually had a vibrant downtown. This is a photograph from Howard Ave and Lemieux Street in Biloxi, and we can see cars driving around, a lot of shops and stores, pedestrians, and this is a common thing when we look at the history of Biloxi. We see some of the art, some of the postcards, some of the older things from the 20th century in Biloxi. We see that there was quite a bit of activity there in the historic downtown that many people have forgotten about today. And so we see a lot of evidence of this in the city of Biloxi. And so that was interesting. When we started this project, we wanted to work very closely with the city of Biloxi to choose an area that we could study for flood resiliency. We wanted an area, obviously, with a lot of impact, that have a lot of activity, both from human activity of people living and working and traveling, and all economically, just a place that's vibrant and that has a history of business and commercial activity. And so we're working closely with the Department of Community Development in Biloxi. We chose this area in the southeastern part of the city. So this is really getting
Hal,
over. Yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt because I know you were on a roll there.
That's
but
fine.
Your screen seems to have frozen.
It has, okay.
It's just showing that beautiful home, the white one. So if you want, I can go ahead and share my screen since you're mid-presentation, and you can just tell me when.
That's fine. Yeah, that's great.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, sorry about that. You just have some great imagery, and I knew we were missing it.
So we'll go with your screen there.
All right, is that the right slide you wanted to be on?
Let's see, for some reason, I'm just seeing oh, okay, now it's coming in. Yeah, that's fine. Thank you very much. So this really shows our project area in the southeastern part of Biloxi. Biloxi actually is quite extensive, more than people realize. There's a part of Biloxi that's really the Gulf side, really on the Gulf side of the bay, and then there's a part of Biloxi north of the bay, really along the I-10 corridor there. So this slide here shows the our project area was an area where we were interested in about 800 to 1,000 buildings in Southeast Biloxi to study their flood resiliency. This next slide gets into kind of we're going from there and looking at the elevation of these areas. So our project area actually, surprisingly, for along the Gulf Coast, there was quite a bit of variation in the elevation. So the southwestern part of our study area, elevations exceeded 20 feet in some places, and the eastern part of our study area dropped down in some places as low as 6 feet or even less than that. So there's quite a bit of variability in ground elevation in our project area. This next slide here shows not only do we have variability in ground elevation, but also the buildings themselves. When we get into looking at the first floor elevation, we go down a street in Biloxi and you'll see some buildings that are elevated quite high, while their neighbors are slab on grade or pretty much right there on the ground. So we were really interested to start to understand the building elevations and build out this inventory, realizing that the ground elevation varies quite a bit. And also, even if the ground were completely flat, some buildings would be higher than others because they're elevated to different levels. So these next slides are going to get into how we basically studied and build an archive, basically the first comprehensive database of first floor elevation. But before we get to that, we noticed that Biloxi has, along with coastal Mississippi, very vulnerable to coastal flooding. This is a photograph I took during Tropical Storm Cristobal in June, and you can see, coastal flooding washing over a road there near Bay St. Louis. This was from a weaker tropical storm, not anywhere near hurricane intensity, that made landfall in Louisiana. Nonetheless, we had some pretty substantial flood impacts there in coastal Mississippi. I think this next slide as well talks about some other flood-related history there in coastal Mississippi. Let's advance to the next slide.
Yeah, right now we're looking at the elevation certificates from the city of Biloxi.
Oh, you are. My computer must be running behind. Here's a slab. Okay, so I had a slide in there with just a slab from Hurricane Katrina. We see a lot of slabs like that in the project area. And then the elevation certificate from Biloxi. So we really use 3 different methods to build a comprehensive building elevation archive. The first was acquiring elevation certificates from the city of Biloxi. So this elevation certificate here, it basically shows the elevation of buildings and the ground. And so we were able to obtain several dozen of these elevation certificates in the project area. So these are officially surveyed elevation. The next slide gets into some, I think, GPS work that we did in the field. And it was a GPS instrument that we took out into the field. So that uses satellite data to basically give us an elevation and a location, and we could shoot what they call a disto. Basically, we could look at the angle that is created from that pole to the building to get the first floor elevation. So we were out on the field doing quite a few of GPS surveys as well. And then this last slide gets into some methods that we used. Another thing we did with this project was street level imagery, basically. So Google Street View, things like that, where we could do a lot of analysis remotely as well. So using elevation certificates, GPS, and street level imagery, we were able to build really this comprehensive first floor elevation database for our project area. And this gets into, I think this next slide gets into showing the results from this work that we did.
Yeah, we're looking at the first floor elevations of buildings in Biloxi, Mississippi.
You are, okay. I'm catching up. Okay, that just came up for me. So the first floor elevation of Biloxi. So this was really interesting. In the project area, we had 26% of the buildings were greater than 18 feet. But then look on the other end, we have 12% that were less than 6 feet. So this is all calibrated to the North American vertical datum of 1988 or of NAVD 88. That's just a datum. So often people think that this is talking about their elevation above mean sea level. It's really not. If you talk, I would say 90% of people will say, this is my elevation above sea level. It's not. It's just an arbitrary vertical line that everything is fixed to the same vertical datum. And so mean sea level is always varying from year to year and from day to day even. And so this is really how high the buildings were across the project area. We were able to elevation data for about 920 buildings in the project area. And then the next slide is interesting. It compares those elevations to the FEMA base flood elevation, which was interesting looking at how. So basically, FEMA requires people to build to a given elevation, and this map just compared each building to its base flood elevation. The base flood elevations varied in the region. Some buildings were required to be 16 feet, some 17, some 18. Most of them were between 16 and 18 feet. And so we can see 18% of the buildings were elevated high, or well, 18% were not even in a FEMA flood zone, so they didn't have a base flood elevation, but 14% of the buildings were elevated above the base flood elevation, but then we can see the rest were below. So basically about 32% of the buildings were either not in the FEMA flood zone or elevated above BFE. The rest of them were basically below base flood elevation. So that's close to about 68%, or about 2/3 of the building were below base flood elevation for their area. So that was interesting. It shows us a snapshot of the vulnerability for those locations. The next slide, then we got into a little bit of talking about coastal flooding here. So these were pictures I took in Tropical Storm Cristobal. And you can see, again, this was just a landfalling tropical storm that made landfall in Louisiana, again, far from the worst case scenario for coastal Mississippi. We had a lot of water over roads, water in people's yards, even left behind a lot of marsh grass along the beach that closed down tourism for several days. So a lot of impacts here from coastal flooding. We really think that coastal Mississippi is one of the most vulnerable areas in the Western Hemisphere to coastal flooding. So it's a big deal with a lot of impacts, even from a glancing blow from a tropical storm. The next slide, I think we get into talking about past historic coastal floods in the area. And so this is a map here of Tropical Storm Cristobal. You can see the track there coming into southeast Louisiana as a tropical storm. And you can see the red dots there. More than 6 feet of salt water was pushed in places like Shell Beach, Louisiana, and St. Louis, Mississippi. Getting over to Biloxi, I think there were about 2 to 3 feet of salt water pushed from Tropical Storm Cristobal. Really interesting, though, and it made it interesting to go to the project area during a storm event. The next slides get into talking a little bit more about coastal flooding from the past. So this is Hurricane Katrina in 2005, obviously the most devastating storm in this part of the country. We know that Katrina actually produced the highest saltwater levels on record in the Western Hemisphere. I run the global storm surge database, and we could not find a higher storm surge event than Hurricane Katrina. Number 2 was Hurricane Camille, that also struck the same area back in 1969. All the black dots there are saltwater pushed more than 16 feet above, basically above the datum there. So really tremendous saltwater flood from Katrina. It was the highest event on record, and it just is a snapshot of how extreme these events can get in this part of the world. Moving on to the next slides, where we'll talk a little bit more about flood vulnerability and what we could do when we look back in time. I spent a lot of time in the archives there in the library in Biloxi, going pretty deep into the archives and trying to find high watermarks for every hurricane and tropical storm I could since 1890. And I found a lot of newspaper archives, historical books. Just we're trying to find really any evidence of any tropical storm or hurricane that produced coastal flooding and adding that to our National Storm Surge database. You can see there's a little bit of character as well for these coastal communities. For example, here, this is a snapshot from the Coast and State and the Sun Herald newspaper in Biloxi from August of 1992, where Hurricane Andrew was coming in as a major hurricane to South Louisiana. And you can see there the subheadline says, the threat of Hurricane Andrew can't stop gambling fever. So it's like, we're in Biloxi, darn it. We're going to gamble. Whether there's a hurricane or not, we're going to not close the casinos, right? So you get a little bit of that flavor with these local newspaper archives, but it also helps us build out our comprehensive flood history. That was part of this project, and these next slides will get into a little bit about what we found. When we got deeper into the archives, looking at the flood history there for Biloxi. So we added these to the USurge database. So this is the global storm surge database for the U.S. We have storm surge data going back to about 1880. For Biloxi, we were able to go back to 1890, and then these next slides will go beyond that and show a little bit about what we found with the coastal flooding. This was really interesting to go back and find the deeper history for a place like Biloxi, just because it's been around for so long, and there's a lot that we could learn. We also got out there with GPS units. So this is a GPS pole that I put. And so one of the issues we came up with this project is that Biloxi does not really have a NOAA tide gauge. So there's a tide gauge in Bay St. Louis. There's a NOAA lab gauge in Pascagoula. There's a long-term NOAA gauge in Dauphin Island, but in Gulfport, Biloxi, there's really a gap along the coast. And so I was able to go out and actually survey the water level back in March. This was amazingly good fortune. At the moment I got there, it was, I think, a short time after high tide. That was the absolute perfect time to survey this, because if it was an incoming tide, it'd be hard to know where you are in the tidal cycle. Right after a high tide, you know exactly where you are in the tidal cycle. This really helped us calibrate the data. And so I went out there, and what I found, and we can go to the next slide, but what I found when I GPSed the high tide mark is that we estimated mean sea level is at about 0.6 of a foot in our data. So again, people think mean sea level is 0. It was not. So one of the issues, again, we came up with here was that Biloxi doesn't have a tide gauge, and how are we going to deal with that? I was asked several times during this project, how high did the water get from Tropical Storm Cristobal? I made some calls, I tried to get out, and it was hard to figure that out. So one of the aspects of this project was, how do we monitor flood levels for a place like Biloxi that doesn't have a NOAA tide gauge? So this is Rick Stickler, who works in the Department of Community Development there in Biloxi, and Rick and I developed quite a friendship. It was an absolute joy to work with him on these kinds of things. Rick has he was a CB with the military, so he can figure things out. I mean, he could make a filet mignon from like a bag of sand and chopsticks or something. He's a very resourceful guy, much more than I am with construction type of issues. So he kind of helped guide me in creating these community flood information systems. And these next two slides kind of show some of the adventures I had. So I came east to Hurricane Sally in September, over to Dauphin Island, and then in the few days after Sally, I came over to Biloxi. Here's a picture of me in a hardware store, and another picture of me in the next slide. I spent way too much time in Hobby Lobby than I'd like to admit, but what we came up with was a system of PVC pipes and these cloth measuring tapes that you get out of the sewing section at Hobby Lobby, and then these next slides get into this community flood information system that we built. So this is basically a monitoring system that you can put out, and so to give you context, this was late September. I was in Biloxi. It was the days after Sally. I was planning to stay in Alabama for some time and help with high water surveys, but as this happened, I live in Galveston, and my hometown was under a major threat from what looked like it would be Hurricane Beta. It ended up being a tropical storm, but when I was in Biloxi working with Rick, it looked like it would be a slow-moving hurricane with 15 to 20 inches of rain. Galveston is very flood-prone, and so Rick and I really worked together developing this community flood information system we can deploy. And so I ended up taking it to Galveston to test it out. And this is a picture, and basically it's simple enough. It's PVC pipes with tape measures, and they're basically zip tied. And this is in downtown Galveston at a friend's house. But the really interesting thing about these, and we can go to the next slide, is that it may seem like, okay, so big deal. So we're measuring water on a pole, but it gets a little bit beyond that, because really what we're doing is calibrating these to elevation certificates. So this is a photograph of Tropical Storm Beta in Galveston. I came out to launch this community flood information system really as part of the Biloxi project, but this was a test run, and we can go through these next slides fairly quickly. So this is, a decent amount of flooding. Parts of Galveston may be the most flood-prone places in the country, not the whole city, but there are parts that are very low-lying, and we get flooding quite a bit. This is Jim and Pat Egler. They were citizen science observers in Sea Isle, Texas. And they basically deployed these flood meters at their house. And when you look at this slide here, if you look closely, you can see that there are the flood meters in the background there tied to a pier on their house. And this shows here the pole on the right shows the level of the water, AGL, basically above ground level. But in this case, it was above their bulkhead. They basically have like a dock there, but the pole on the left, you can see it's different. The one on the right, the water comes up to 18. The one on the left, it comes up to 66. What we did was calibrate this with their elevation certificate. So this elevation, when we get surveys, we get elevation certificates where surveyors give the elevation of our ground and our first floor area above this datum called North American Vertical Datum of 1988. It sounds complicated, but basically everything's in the same system. Everything's in the same datum. And so Jim and Pat noted that the water got to about 66 inches. I was shocked by how excited people were to participate in this. Jim and Pat were celebrating their 47th wedding anniversary, and I asked if it wouldn't be too much trouble for them to take a picture every 3 hours. I didn't expect a photo at 3 a.m., but they did. They got up in the middle of the night. They were very happy to participate. And this was really cool because we were actually monitoring in real time, where there was no tide gauge, how high the water level was above the datum. And these next slides then get into talking a little bit more about how the community used these data and how excited the community were to really participate in this project. So again, this was calibrated to the elevation certificates. And these are just a few of the messages I got from people. Like, I private messaged you with a copy of my elevation certificate. Other people saying that you can use my property. I'd love to be involved. The second image here, the next one, gets into some more comments from people. People saying you're welcome to use our site. You're welcome to use our house. Someone said email was sent to you with elevation certificates. I think more than a dozen people sent me their elevation certificates and said we would love to be a citizen science observer. So we can go on to the next slide, but really what this showed was that people were excited to be involved. They were engaged, and it really was interesting. I hadn't really had this level of engagement. Usually I'm used to looking at data off of tide gauges and things like that. Because so many people offered their elevation certificates, and in this community, Jim and Pat were taking observations, and we calibrated that. We were able to produce an inundation map really in real time as the storm was going on, and we color-coded this very carefully. If you're in yellow, your ground is dry. If you're in green, your ground is even more dry, you're higher, but anywhere in blue, you've been inundated. And so this should calibrate very closely to people's elevation certificates. Very important in communities where people are evacuating, and other people maybe have a vacation home or a rental property. A lot of people are not with their properties when these flood events happen, and because everything was calibrated in the same system, people in Dallas or Austin or these other places could know if they flooded in this storm. And we think that the same thing would be very applicable for Biloxi and cities like Biloxi, cities that do not have a tide gauge. This gives a system to go out, deploy these flood meters, and we can know what's happening in real time. As we go to the next slide, the last thing I wanted to say about this is that, we see these flood forecasts coming in from the Hurricane Center that talk about 4 to 6 feet of flooding above normally dry ground and things like that. And one moment, please. For some reason, my thing logged off, but we see a lot of these the flood forecasts that are the forecast above normally dry ground, and people don't know what it means. At the end of the day, people just really care about, is my property going to flood? And if so, when? That's just all they really care about. They don't really care how high they are above the high tide or above the normally dry ground. And so that's something that we noticed in this project, was that this allowed everything to go into the same system, and that really helps people understand what's happening. Hey, I cannot see the imagery anymore. It seems like I've been kicked out.
Well, we can still hear you and see you, so
Okay.
that's good. And we're on an image of you with one of your, I'm guessing, citizen observers on a dock.
Oh, you know what? That was actually in Delcombe, Louisiana last week. I was with, that is CNN meteorologist Derek Van Dam. And the beauty of this flood information system is that we can take it on the road. And so the more we test this out, the more we can really get to see this in action and learn some things. And so I was not able to calibrate that last week with the datum, but I was able to put one of these meters out and see the relative rise of the water level. And so in that case, with that gauge in Delcombe, Louisiana last Friday, as we were doing work, and CNN, I think, did something on social media, we were able to know in late Friday afternoon, the water was rising at 6 inches an hour. So that was really cool. There's no official tide gauge there, but we could deploy the system and kind of see what's happening in real time, which was pretty cool. Let's see.
So I've gone now to a slide that says, so far we've talked about data collection of building elevations and historic flood data, but what about analysis?
Yeah, so we have, so far we've talked for our flood history mean. And so these next slides are going to get into really the analysis of the data and basically bringing some statistics into it to analyze the data and help us understand our vulnerability a little better. We can go to the next slide.
All right, so now I'm on a slide that's showing the frequency of extreme water levels.
Is that the one with the graph there?
No, that's where I was. I can go back to that one.
Oh, okay, I see. I'm trying to log in the other computers. Basically, what we were able to do was we were able to create a graphic and analyze the statistics of the extreme water levels. And so on the graph you're on, Renee, basically we were able to use data and statistic to get our 100-year flood levels based on long-term data. And so we came up with, I think, around 18 to 19 feet for the 100-year flood. The 500-year flood is closer to 26 feet. But this, again, what we were able to do is measure this above the annually adjusted mean sea level. And so that's just basically taking sea level out. And so, for example, Katrina, we were concerned how much water did Katrina push above sea level in 2005? For Camille, above sea level in 1969. So that first number is basically the extreme water levels above the annually adjusted mean sea level. But then adding that now in the next slide to the NAVD88 datum. So again, keep in mind the mean sea level is not zero. From our GPS work, we found the mean sea level is about 0.6 of a foot. So for that next slide, I just added 0.6 of a foot to that. And so we were able to get, for example, a 100-year flood level of coming up to 19.07 feet. So again, this is if you have your elevation certificate and you say, wow, my house is at 19 feet, you are now slightly below the 100-year flood level, if that makes sense.
Yikes.
So it gives us an idea of where people are in comparison. And this is based on data since 1890 from 33 hurricanes and tropical storms. Then I think there's just 2 slides left. Is there one with a graph of those levels, a scatter plot?
I'm on that slide now.
Yeah, so that really what we did is we took a scatter plot of all the building elevations. It's 920 building elevations, and then we basically laid those over these extreme water levels. And we saw, for example, only about 19% of the homes are elevated higher than the data-driven 100-year flood level. I want to mention something as well. There are a lot of great initiatives right now to use different modeling efforts to redo the flood maps as well for Biloxi. What we did is these will not be the official, base flood elevation. So when I mentioned, for example, a 19-foot 100-year flood, those will not be official numbers. Those are not really being ingested into the new FEMA maps. Those are really, what we're doing with data-driven science, and it's meant to really come along the other efforts to just give kind of a sanity check, if you will. Just do the modeling efforts make sense? Are they ballpark? Are they underestimated? Are they overestimated? This just gives us a different snapshot. But again, just seeing, wow, only 19% of the buildings are elevated above what the data suggests would be, say, a 100-year flood added on to sea level. It gives you an idea that places like Biloxi are quite vulnerable to flooding with, roughly 80% of their buildings below what we think could get flooded on average every 100 years. And that's not even talking about sea level rise. That's just, taking the sea level from this year right now. That may bring us to the last slide. Is there a picture just of a gentleman in a red shirt?
Yes, that is.
And that's, the last thing I wanted to talk about was community engagement in Biloxi. So, we did not get as much engagement as we had hoped for because of COVID. I did those field surveys in mid-March. It was like right before everything shut down. And then unfortunately, after that, a lot of our workshops and a lot of our opportunities to really get there, engage with people in group settings and also individual settings, those were kind of taken away because of the pandemic, unfortunately. That photograph, though, it was interesting. I went out on the street in Biloxi and I was doing GPS surveys. And this was very interesting. That gentleman there in the red shirt was so excited about what we were doing. Like, he knew of the entire flood history for the neighborhood. He grew up in that neighborhood. He was so excited. It was Friday night. He invited me in for sweet tea, and we sat there for probably an hour and a half just talking about flood resiliency in his community. very interested in what we're doing, very appreciative of what we're doing. I thought it was ironic because about 30 minutes before I engaged with him, a man came up to me very directly, was right in my face, and was very upset that when I use this GPS thing, I'm looking through basically a camera type of feature, and he thought I was photographing his house. He was very upset about infringing his privacy. So I thought this is really interesting. On the same street, I have someone that's very upset that I'm there and I'm taking measurements of his house. And then 30 minutes later, there's someone that wants to invite me in for sweet tea and is very appreciative. And that kind of reminded me of some of the first coastal resiliency work I did in coastal Alaska. We would have Village A would say, please do not map out our native burial grounds. That's private information and it's intrusive. And then Village B would say, please do map out our burial grounds because it's so important to us. We want that documented. And, you know, it's kind of like on social media. If you tag 5 people, 3 are going to be neutral. Maybe 1 is so appreciative and then 1 may be very upset. You know, so what I found and what I think learned through this project is it's really important to be on the ground and really engage with the community. And the city of Biloxi has been awesome. Mississippi Alabama Sea Grant working with Stephen Deal, it's been great. I mean, just there's been a lot of great, very involved players with this. Of course, Northern Gulf of Mexico, Sentinel Site Cooperative, there have been a lot of great, very important project partners here, which has enabled us to get on the ground and meet as many people as possible despite the pandemic. But we've seen, you know, it depends almost sometimes even neighborhood by neighborhood, how receptive people are. And there's a wide range of you know, feedback that we got from people. But from this other work we did with the community information systems, we've seen if you're providing data to help protect people and help people make better decisions, I was shocked by how many people in Tropical Storm Beta were so excited that we were doing real-time flood inundation mapping. It was helping them make decisions. And really that initiative comes out of the Biloxi project because we built those mobile flood meters for Biloxi because we thought this would be very helpful to fill in a crucial data gap there in Biloxi. So everyone, thank you so much for your attention. I apologize with the technology here. That's all on me. I tested this from a mobile. I was in storm chasing last week, and it seemed to work then, and it's for whatever reason, I had some technological problems today. Thank you so much for your patience, especially Renee, but everyone else. And I'm really looking forward to the other speakers and all the discussion we get today in this exciting Neighborhood Resiliency Cafe.
All right, I guess just go ahead and turn it over to Megan to kind of talk about some of the green infrastructure plan evaluation.
All right, sounds good. Everyone see my screen?
I can see it.
All right, great. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for having us. My name is Megan, and I'm joined by my colleague Sweta, who you'll hear from shortly. Both of us, like Stephen mentioned, both of us are from Auburn University's Community Planning Program. And we're going to talk today about a research project that we're currently working on, which is funded also by the Mississippi Alabama Sea Grant Consortium. We'll share some preliminary findings that we have from our work. So as the title suggests, this project is broadly focused on mediating the impacts of local flooding through green infrastructure planning. So as I know, we all are all too well aware, the growth and development of urban areas can threaten ecosystems as undeveloped land is converted into impervious surfaces. This in turn can lead to degraded ecosystem services, increased flooding and potential damage. This is particularly an issue for coastal cities, again, as we're all too aware, as these locations make them susceptible to natural disasters such as hurricanes. And then when this locational vulnerability is coupled with land development, coastal cities' vulnerability and the risk for damages increases. So this concept and this practice of green infrastructure has emerged as a tool for minimizing negative impacts of growth and development on a city and its ecosystems. And green infrastructure broadly refers to multifunctional networks of open space and nature-based stormwater management projects that are planned, created, and preserved with the goal of creating more resilient communities that can respond quickly and effectively to flooding events. So green infrastructure projects can range from connecting greenways and protecting wetlands at the more macro level to creating bioretention ponds, green roofs, rain gardens, down to a more micro level. So while green infrastructure is gaining traction in planning practice and research continues to demonstrate and document its effectiveness, the question remains if coastal cities are incorporating green infrastructure planning and practices into their comprehensive plans, and if there's strategic action steps for implementing them. So it's at this juncture that our research, our project intervenes. So this project's a collaboration between faculty from Auburn University's Community Planning Program, as well as our Landscape Architecture Program. We had some assistance from the Geosciences Department, as well as local and regional partners in the Mississippi Coastal Region, including the cities of Biloxi, Gulfport, Ocean Springs, Iberville, and Pascagoula in Mississippi, and Mobile, Gulf Shores, Ocean Beach, Orange Beach, and Pritchard in Alabama, as well as several regional and state level planning entities. So the aim of the project is to identify best practices related to green infrastructure planning and stormwater management, and to share this knowledge among partners in other coastal cities with the idea that they'll become more resilient. So to do this, an advisory committee comprised of local and regional planning partners was established as a means to facilitate conversations and information sharing, to identify best practices in green infrastructure planning, and to assess the degree to which these practices are incorporated in the city's comprehensive plans. So as such, the partner cities' comprehensive plans were examined in order to understand the degree to which green infrastructure is planned for and supported via this one document, albeit a city council approved document that provides a vision for the community. Using existing scholarship on this, a scorecard was created to evaluate each city's comprehensive plans and to generate a plan quality score. And the results from this then are intended to help identify strong areas within cities' plans, as well as areas that could be strengthened. So in addition then, a survey and interviews with the project partners was conducted in order to collect more detailed information on their actual planning practices, capacities, experiences, opportunities, and constraints. And then finally, we undertook an extensive green infrastructure landscape analysis in order to identify landscape patterns that should be protected. So we collected data on regional and local landscape patterns and analyzed them for almost 1,300 subbasins in the broader Mississippi, Alabama coastal region using various GIS tools with the goal of assessing their impact on stormwater runoff. So today then, we're going to share some preliminary results from this project, starting with the plan evaluation aspect. So like I mentioned, we created a scorecard to evaluate each city's comprehensive plan from a green infrastructure perspective. The scorecard was created based on existing scholarship on plan quality evaluation, as well as on green infrastructure planning. And there's a total of 6 components, as shown here, each with several indicators within the scorecard. So within each component, there are indicators that are specific to green infrastructure planning. So for example, incentive-based tools that encourage green infrastructure projects. And there are indicators that support and enhance the effective use and implementation of green infrastructure planning. So for example, assessing future housing demands and its impact on the natural environment. Let me say a little bit more about each of these 6 components, and then I'll get into our results. So the first component is the fact base, which offers a description of the current conditions as well as projections for the future. So this information is important for understanding where current development is, where it's likely to take place in the future, and hopefully to inform future decisions about development. So this information in turn allows planners to assess reductions in green space, increased stormwater runoff from impervious surfaces, for example, which are all related to the need for green infrastructure. The goals and objectives component details the overarching intention and priorities of the plan and the specific actions along with measurable outcomes that are need to be taken to actualize them. So goals and objectives related to green infrastructure could include encouraging open green spaces, controlling or reducing stormwater runoff and flooding, minimizing impervious surfaces resulting from development, or promoting green infrastructure and low impact developments. Policies, tools, and strategies allow communities to operationalize their goals and objectives and then to guide decision making. So policies, tools, and strategies related to green infrastructure can be categorized into 4 broad categories: regulatory, incentive-based, public acquisition, and capital improvement strategies. Examples are provided here on this slide, albeit in pretty small font to get them all on there. Implementation, monitoring, and evaluation refers to a plan's description of how it's going to carry out its work, monitor its progress, and evaluate if it's achieving its goals. From a green infrastructure perspective, this includes a process for focusing on ecological health and human impacts, such as measuring stormwater runoff. The organizational coordination and capacity component addresses the fact that successful planning requires coordination with other organizations and departments within a given municipality, with higher levels of organization that may set guidelines or provide funding, as well as with neighboring municipalities that share ecological features. So since environmental and ecological issues don't necessarily respect political boundaries and are affected by many interdisciplinary factors, this coordination and the capacity of organizations and departments to coordinate is essential to green infrastructure planning. And the last component, public participation. As we know, meaningful public participation in the planning process is widely accepted as a best practice within the planning field and others, which can increase the overall support for the final plan, the community support for a plan that comes out. And participation extends beyond just the plan development phase and includes involving the public in ongoing monitoring, evaluation, and planning decisions. And the participation process also facilitates the sharing of experiences, developing a common understanding of the issues facing a community, and promoting awareness of how decisions and their impacts are interrelated. So that is a very quick, basic overview of the plan evaluation criteria, and here are our results. Overall, the partner cities' comprehensive plans have an average score of 43.9 out of possible 60 points, indicating that the plans collectively represent a high level of quality and green infrastructure engagement. However, the scores have a wide spread, with scores ranging from 32.9 on the low end and 55.8 on the high end. The highest scoring components across all, when we look collectively across all plans, the highest scoring components are the goals and objectives component and the policies, tools, and strategies component. The lowest scoring components overall are the implementation, monitoring, and evaluation component, and the public participation component. And then falling somewhere in the middle overall are the fact-based component and the organizational coordination and capacity component. So this suggests that while goals and policies are clearly articulated in cities' comprehensive plans and are well supported by data, there's limited processes for ensuring that the plan's actions will actually be executed in practice and that there are systems of accountability in place. The low overall score in public participation raises some concerns about the role of the public and the community, how they were involved in the creation of these plans and their ongoing engagement in planning processes and decisions. And then finally, the project partners were asked to participate in a web-based survey and an interview in order to gather detailed information from them directly on their planning practices, processes, organizational capacity, planning responsibility and oversight, and resources, as well as general experiences, opportunities, and constraints related to green infrastructure planning. So a couple of general themes from the survey and interviews, which align more closely with these overall plan evaluation results. Are all organizations indicated that they have implemented and or used some form of green infrastructure. So 56% reported that their comprehensive plans have sustainability as an overarching goal. 22% noted that the presence of local mandates in their cities that require some use of green infrastructure or some broader focus on enforcing sustainability and focus on environmental issues. Additionally, there are a number of important green infrastructure projects that are currently underway in these cities, as well as many noteworthy best practices being utilized. Just two quick examples would be prioritizing tree plantings and permeable surfaces in the design review evaluations and process, as well as tree preservation ordinance. However, there was also a number of barriers that were noted by our partners, including limited political leadership, action, and support for implementing green infrastructure projects, less than effective collaboration and coordination within agencies and with other partner agencies in the community, limited accountability and oversight for ensuring that what's in a city's comprehensive plan or its other related plans gets implemented and that ordinances get enforced, and then the need for more proactively focused funding resources as opposed to the disaster relief focused funding resources. So with that, then, I will turn it over to my colleague, Sweta, who will talk more about the final components of this research.
Okay, thank you, Megan. So for our final goal of identifying landscape patterns that should be protected with the goal of transferring this knowledge to the Mississippi, Alabama coastal communities, what we did was an extensive landscape analysis for green infrastructure. And when I say green infrastructure, we considered vegetation, wetlands, and barren lands in particular as regional green infrastructure. And the purpose is, again, to identify the open spaces and the floodplains, the green spaces, and specifically the landscape patterns that should be protected. So we examined, for this portion of the work, what we did was we examined a much wider region, which is about 1,290 subbasins, so pretty large region in both the states. We divided this region into 8 watersheds or subgroups, as shown in this map. We have the Daphne Fairhope Foley area and Mobile area, which is divided into 3 watersheds each. And then we have the Mississippi region, which is divided into 2 watersheds, which are pretty large. One of them is really large. The delineation of the watersheds was based on the data which we retrieved from the USGS GOD stations using ArcHydro, which is an extension of ArcGIS. And the black dots that you see on this map are actual locations of the USGS GOD stations that measure stormwater runoff. So what I will do is I will share some of the process and methodology that we used, particularly in GIS and FragStats, and as well as some of our preliminary the regression results. This is an ongoing analysis, so any output and results are preliminary, and we are still working on it. So this is a slide showing a data collection. Next slide, Megan, please. We collected extensive data on local and regional landscape patterns and analyzed them for the 1290 subbasins that I mentioned using ArcSWAT and FragStats. First, the general characteristics and peak runoff during the 3-year period, 2014 to 2016, was estimated for the 8 watersheds. And then the impacts of landscape patterns on the variations and the mean annual peak runoff, analyzed using OLS regression. So several data sets were collected, including mean annual peak runoff depth, the mean annual precipitation, average watershed slope, average watershed soil permeability, floodplain area, natural drainage density, wetlands, and impervious rate. So the data in the specific tools that we use to estimate each of these are listed in the table, so I won't go into those details, along with the descriptive statistics for each of them. In our analysis, the mean annual runoff is the dependent variable, and the rest are control variables that we use in regression. Again, the purpose is to determine the impact of landscape patterns on stormwater runoff, with the goal of sharing these findings and knowledge with the regional and local partners towards creating more resilient and sustainable communities, coastal communities. Next slide, please. So this slide is basically showing one of the tools that we used for estimating stream flow through an ungorged basin in a watershed. So this is called the Soil and Water Assessment Tool, or SWAT. And this is used widely for discharge modeling. So we applied this SWAT tool to estimate the amount of runoff, stormwater runoff. Each watershed was modeled separately using ArcSWAT tool in ArcGIS. And the watershed and the USGS gauge list was prepared and collected for the 8 watersheds as well. So the inputs that you need for the SWAT model are the digital elevation modeling, or DEM, database, the land use, soil type, weather, and also what is crucial is the observed discharge data at one of the sub-watersheds outlets. While the first 4 are used for stimulating the discharge data, the observed discharge data is actually used for calibrating and validating the model. So the peak annual runoff here with the area of the watershed was used to calculate the runoff depth for each subbasin, which what this means is to predict the stream flow in the ungorged basins, we also need to have stream flow records, which must be available for at least one of the locations within the watershed. The actual stream flow values are then statistically compared with the model values for that location, and the model is calibrated and validated by changing the sensitive parameters until the model performance is acceptable. And once it is acceptable, the discharge values can then be, for the required location, can then be used for the study, right? Next slide, please. This is showing the type of analysis and the landscape metrics that we developed to describe the spatial structure of patches, class of patches, or entire landscapes. So at different scales of analysis. And the landscape pattern analysis is particularly useful and provides us information about, what is the composition of the landscape and what is the configuration of the landscape itself. So, things like what is the proportion of each land cover type present, what is the shape and size of landscape elements, and the relationship between these different elements. So, how close they are to each other, the proximity, and all of those kind of different measures. So using GIS tools of ArcPro and FragStats, we analyzed landscape patterns for all of these 1,290 subbasins and measured the following: the percentage of landscape, or the proportion, the edge density, shape density, contiguity, proximity, and various other things like connection and cohesion indices. And there are some other metrics that we also measured, such as a diversity index, the Shannon diversity index. That's not listed over here. The expectation is that desirable landscape patterns consist of larger patches and more connected and unfragmented patches in corridors and wide corridors, as well as heterogeneous areas of nature throughout the human developed areas. So that is what we are expecting to find. Next slide, please. So this slide is just showing, we can get a whole bunch of database and numbers. This slide is just trying to illustrate what do these actual metrics look like? What does landscape patterns look like on a map? What is a low value? What does it mean? What versus a high value, and what does that mean? So this particular slide is illustrating edge density, for example. And low values are on the left of the screen and high values are on the right side of the screen. A large value of edge density for a green infrastructure land cover class would be expected to reduce the mean and peak runoff because of the increased complexity and convolution. Next slide, please. Similarly, this one is an illustration of the proximity index. A low value again on the left and high value on the right. A high value in proximity index of a green infrastructure patch would be expected to reduce peak runoff as well. Conversely, a high value in urban patches or development would be expected to increase peak runoff. Next slide, please. This image is illustrating the Shannon's diversity index. Again, low value on the left and high value on the right. A high value of this diversity index would be expected to decrease runoff. So these are just some of the illustrations. We developed a whole range of indices using FragStats, and these became our test variables for the OLS analysis. Next slide. Okay, so let me share some of the preliminary results of the OLS analysis. Again, this is a work in progress. So we are still working out some of the details here, but the preliminary outcomes of the OLS regression explain some of the impacts of the different green infrastructure land uses in terms of their shape, size, isolation, cluster, and connectivity, and the impact that they have on local flooding while controlling for other environmental conditions. So we ran 4 separate preliminary models, one each for barren lands, for vegetation, for wetlands, and for development. So our preliminary results are showing that, as expected, of course, in all models, average precipitation and natural drainage density are significant and very significant and strong predictors of runoff. meaning that higher the rainfall and higher the natural drainage density, higher the runoff. Natural drainage density is basically just a ratio of the stream length to the area of the watershed. And in 3 out of the 4 models, percentage of wetlands is also very significant and has a negative association with runoff. Higher the percentage of wetlands in the subbasin, lower the runoff. If we look specifically at the smaller models, in the wetlands model, we find that the percentage of landscape for wetlands, so basically the proportion of wetlands, has a significant impact on runoff, and also so a greater proportion of wetlands is associated with reduced runoff. That's as per expected. That's a finding. That's an expected finding. And more connected wetlands are also associated with reduction in runoff. So rather than isolated patches here and there, a more connected network of wetlands works better. In the vegetation model, what we find is that the percentage of landscape, again, for vegetation, or basically the proportion of vegetation, which could be forests and other shrubs and things like that, is highly significant and reduces runoff as well. Also, more proximity of different connected vegetation patterns is significant and is associated with reduced runoff as well. Interestingly, for the barren lands model, we didn't really find any very significant landscape pattern that would have a significant association with runoff. Only the Euclidean nearest neighbor, which is again a GIS metric for, as the crow flies, what's the nearest similar land pattern of development. And it has a significant, but the effect is very marginal, so close to 0. So it's not really of much relevance. No other landscape measure for barren lands was found to have any significant effect on runoff. When it comes to the development model, the proximity of development, or how close the development is, has a significant positive association with runoff. That's as per expected. We also found, interestingly, that connectivity has a significant association with runoff. This was a little bit unexpected because it implies that more connected development is associated with reduced runoff. It's kind of counterintuitive, so we have to kind of look at this a little bit more in detail. And so there were also several other expected associations that we found in our studies in the right direction, in the expected direction, even though some of these were not statistically significant. So I'm not going to talk about those in detail, but the results were generally as expected. And generally the findings suggest that the size, fragmentation, and connectivity of vegetation and wetlands do matter. So green infrastructure planning should extend beyond the local scale and local plans and local planning to consider overall networking and clustering at a regional scale. So maybe something of a regional green infrastructure or a regional landscape plan, which covers a much larger area, does make sense, because we are concerned about connectivity and scale as well as the size. So again, this is an ongoing part of the research, and we plan to share some more findings in greater detail in subsequent conferences. Thank you. That's all I have for now. So this is just a slide showing the contact information of the project team. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you for sharing your findings there. And we're just going to kind of briefly go through quickly just some quick questions we had from the chat. The first question will be for Hal. Hal, you mentioned that your study indicated as many as 68% of structures in your study area are at or below BFE. Do you know if and how the city will use this vulnerability information?
Hey everyone, this is Hal. That's a really good question. I don't know And I think, though, it really helps the city identify not only how many buildings are below base flood elevation, but where they are. And so that, I think, will be something very interesting that comes out of this project. I'm very curious what the city would have to say about that. I know from talking to Rick Stickler, one of the initial things he said, he saw an immediate value of this for, say, like emergency management. You know, here comes a storm, and now we know really where our lower lying buildings are. You can't just know that from ground elevation because, again, some buildings are elevated above the ground, others are not elevated as high. So I think that's an interesting next step in the dialogue. I think will be, now that we have these results, what's the application of those? And it's a great question from the participants that asked, because it's all about applying these data and how does that impact our choices moving ahead.
All right, all right. And we have, let's see, we have two other questions here from the Green Infrastructure Plan evaluation. One is, could local government green infrastructure monitoring be improved through coordination with neighborhood associations or small community nonprofits?
Yeah, absolutely. I think kind of that was one of the things that our partners noted was the need for greater collaboration, really effective collaboration around these issues. And the more buy-in there was about the issues, the more momentum and political pressure that could be applied as well. A lot of participants mentioned this idea that local residents don't necessarily see how their individual actions contribute to flooding or these larger environmental issues. And so part of the public participation piece is, right, having these conversations and having individual residents see how all these pieces are connected and how their behavior impacts the larger area. So I would say absolutely. I think neighborhood associations and nonprofits, increasing that awareness, that knowledge, and a lot of community knowledge that's aware there too to tap into, right, of best practices of things that people are doing individually at their own level. And as we wrap up this project, one of our goals too is to share this scorecard that I talked about with communities, so they can whoever that is in the community, so they can monitor on an ongoing basis how they're doing from a planning perspective. Okay,
all right. And we got one final question, and just, I think you might have mentioned this a little bit, is about, are there plans to share examples of green infrastructure best practices with other communities in our region?
I would say we're working on that. By the end of the research, we will have some more specific examples and best practices to share. But I will note of the plan evaluation results, Biloxi was the highest scoring plan on our results. So it's a publicly available document. You can just go to their website and take a look at their plan.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you all for your participation and for those who submitted questions.